We are live. Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining this week's weekly demo. To set the stage a little bit, my name is Jimmy Sopko. I lead sales at Ascend.io. John Means leads our sales engineering team. He's going to be conducting the demo. And today we're going to talk about garbage collection in your enterprise data warehouse. We all know that bad data and bad insights is a big hindrance on businesses. A recent study from IBM showed it was a $3 trillion problem. And a big part of that is orphaned data sets. And the big problem in the business is when executives or data stakeholders receive data and insights, they either don't trust it or it's late. And so you end up either not making decisions or making decisions late that cost the business money. So I'm going to pass it off to John to get into the technical weeds and showcase how Ascend solves this problem with our data pipeline automation platform.
Thanks, Jimmy. One other thing that can happen that arguably could be like the worst is you make a decision on wrong data, on old data, and you're actually spending money going to do something without accurate data. So we're going to talk about today what can seem to feel like a very simple, oh, it's just deleting tables, cleaning up tables. It can't be that important, but it really is. And we're going to talk through how Ascend's automatic and intelligent pipelines remove a ton of the tedious tasks of database and data warehouse object management. I've been working in this space in a couple different roles in the data space as data engineer, data analyst, kind of DBA type roles. And if you've done that, you probably know and are familiar with getting some sort of quarterly email with a list of tables and owners from a DBA, from a data engineer asking you, hey, can we delete this thing? Because you get a lot of buildup of obsolete and old objects and items that just create clutter and create bloat on your warehouse. And the reason why that happens is a lot of other code-based orchestration solutions are not data aware like Ascend is, meaning that they don't have the connection between the object that we're creating and the orchestration logic. So when you change one, those tools don't know to change the other, and it results in a lot of orphaned and obsolete data sets in your data warehouse. This becomes really problematic when you are constantly updating your transformation logic or your orchestration logic to add columns, rename things to make them even more visible and logical and understanding what a certain table is in your database, which is a good practice to do so long as you aren't creating a lot of, we'll just call it garbage. And so what that results in negatively is poor data quality and accuracy downstream for your data, for your users. And so with Ascend, you don't have any more orphan data sets in your warehouse that can cause confusion to end users. All of your consumers of that data know that the data and tables in your Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery warehouse are live and updated regularly. They can use them with confidence. You don't need to worry about an analyst using an obsolete data set. And like Jimmy and I were just talking about, making a decision on old data or data that is just not up to date. And so that's where you get a lot of these cost savings, is from having a clean and consistent environment to work in. You don't have to have your data engineers spending hours and time on doing custodial processes and services. Let Ascend be your garbage man and just come and take all the stuff away. And you don't need to worry about that. Let your data engineers work on higher value tasks than, hey, can I delete these tables? So I'll jump into it and show you what that looks like in Ascend. And we'll actually get into how Ascend allows you to do this really easily and actually makes it something that you don't even need to think about and worry about. So let me jump into my Ascend account. So today we'll be walking through a demo on Snowflake, but I'll always call out here that Ascend runs on effectively any data plane between this applies to BigQuery and Databricks as well. Here we go. Awesome. So here I am in the home screen of our internal demo environment. What we talked about in former sessions is we talked about data flows now, and we worked through building a data flow, and we'll jump back into that. But a really important concept to understand is how data flows sit within a data service and the naming conventions about what you create in Ascend and the objects that it then creates in your data warehouse. So I'll be working in my data service called John Means Demo. So when I come into the data service, you have some options around the settings on that data service itself. A really important one to go to, which I always recommend you start with, is data plane configuration. This is essentially saying, what backend system in Snowflake are we writing to, and what is the warehouse configuration? How are we actually communicating and working with that warehouse? And there's three really important parameters here that you can set around the template. And this is effectively telling us, how do we create objects consistently in your warehouse? So you know that every time an object is created in Ascend, that the respective table, schema, database is created in Snowflake in your data warehouse. And so these templates are ways to do that. And what we're passing in here in these curly brackets is effectively just a system column or a system information up from Ascend. So, and we'll show this here in a second. For a database template, we're basically saying when you create a data service, in my case, it was John Means demo, we're just going to pass that through to Snowflake. So let me jump into Snowflake here and we can take a look. And sure enough, when I created my service, we immediately created a, let me refresh this and scroll through. Close a couple of these. My data flow in my service within that database. And then what we're doing additionally is actually adding in within that database, schema and table naming convention as well. So you know that every time a new data flow is created, Ascend will automatically create a schema with that name and then a table for each component in that schema. So let's actually just show you what that looks like in a data flow. So let's come back to mine and we'll jump into this weather data flow. So this should look familiar to anyone that maybe joined the prior webinars. If not, we've got links to those that you can check this out. But we built a data flow, and each of these components in here is going to relate to a table in Snowflake. So let's come in here. Let's actually take a look at what we created. We created a data flow that's called Simple Ascend Demo Template. And we can see that Ascend automatically created the respective schema in Snowflake. That's just done automatically. You don't need to worry about that. You don't need to create the schema in advance. You don't have to manage that. If you change the data flow name, we'll change the schema name in Snowflake respectively, so you don't have two duplicates of the same version where you're only working on one now and the old one becomes obsolete. Within the data flow, each component results in a table in Snowflake. So when we added in weather sensor data, you can see here that we created the respective table within Snowflake. And so we can take a look at a sample of that data. Now, what's really awesome and really cool that Ascend does that other tools don't do is if I want to update, let's say I want to update weather stations and I want to rename one of these objects. So weather sensor data, let's just say you're like, actually, I think there's a better way to identify this. I'm going to call this raw sensor data, and I'll update this component name in Ascend. Now, all we did is update a component. On the back end in Snowflake, we're also going to update that table here. So what we previously had is weather sensor data. If I refresh this and I come back, now it's raw sensor data. That's a very small thing that we just did, but typically you can see how as you make changes, if you aren't doing cleanup of objects and keeping them 100% in tune with your pipeline, that things can get really confusing because you would have a table that was weather sensor data and that one is no longer getting updated. Someone could start using that and making poor decisions with that data. It's not up to date. It's not live. So here, you know that every time you're using any data from Ascend, that it's up to date. Let's take another example. Let's go into our pipeline. And if you recall last time, we added weather stations, we joined that data together, and then we update the pipeline. Let's undo those changes and see how our Snowflake warehouse is updated. So I'm going to edit define rainy day. I'm actually just going to point this to raw sensor data again. And so if I come back to the DAG, you can see here was our original flow. And let's just delete weather stations transform and weather stations. And so let's say I want to undo these changes, remove some items. We're changing the pipeline. Maybe we're consolidating things, whatever you're doing. Let's delete these two. And now let's come back into Snowflake and refresh this. Now you can see here in the schema on the left, I wish I could actually expand this because this is what we're really focusing on. There we go. On the left here, now we're only left with the exact components that live within the pipeline right now, immediately. This is incredibly, incredibly important. And I think as folks start building in Ascend, you'll find that this is extremely valuable because you can confidently build from here. There's a couple other things that I'll just call out while we're looking at it. You'll see that not only do we have just each component, we have raw sensor data, define rainy day, max sensor reading by day, right? We've got each of those. You see a couple of these other ones here around meta, data list ascend meta. Now data test ascend meta. So on the data test, that's because at one point on our rainy day component, we had asserted data quality test to say, let's go ahead and take a look at, I think we have, I can take a look at the schema. We want to say, make sure that data quality of precipitation column is always less than, let's just say 1,000. You're never going to have more than 1,000. If you have more than 1,000 inches of rain in any given day, we want to flag a error on this pipeline. And so we keep that information here to provide you information about the test. We ran, and you can go into Ascend and see each time we ran that test, the result of the test, what was the query that we ran, and when did we run that test. We persist that information because that's important to know when a certain data quality test was passed or when it failed. So there's some things that we keep there when they're important. Other things we remove to keep it consistent with your pipeline. Now, if I go back to our data service setting, we know that there's sometimes cases where maybe you don't want to just hard delete things because you want to keep an audit trail in your data warehouse of how did this data live at a certain point in time. For auditing purposes, time series analysis, whatever it may be, you want to make sure that some people are uncomfortable with just letting things be deleted. So on the data service setting, you can actually define the data cleanup strategy. We use delete tables by default. So when you delete a component, we delete the table. But what you can also do is you can set to either archive tables or keep tables. Not many people are using keep tables, but if you wanted to just keep that long list and manage all of that, you can. But the archive table setting is really, really awesome. What archive tables does is when you delete a component, we will rename it with a timestamp and append archive to that table name. So you'll know that it is archived and you'll know when it was archived. Anyone downstream looking at that data in Snowflake will know, hey, this was an archived data table from Ascend. So I can update that to archive tables. Let's go back into our data service and let's just take a look at what that would look like. So let's re-add in. Actually, what we can do is, this will break a few things, but that's all right. We can do this. I'm going to delete max sensor reading by day, and I'll delete that component. Actually, I can't delete that component because we have dependencies downstream. So Ascend actually protects you from doing anything too damaging to your pipeline. So let's just re-add in weather stations again. And we'll re-add it, and then we'll delete it. Take a look at the schema. Let's create that object. So now weather stations is coming back into our pipeline. When we come back into Snowflake pretty quickly here, we should be able to see weather stations table exist in just a matter of a couple seconds once we bring that in. We'll give it another second here. There we go. We've got our weather stations object. We can take a look at a preview of the data. That's just that raw data that we're bringing in from S3, right? Now, when I come in here to delete an object with the archive strategy selected, let's delete the component. And let's see what happens in Snowflake. There we go. Weather stations archive with a timestamp. That is awesome. That is something that everyone, if you want archived tables, you don't need to write the code to say append archive, append the timestamp. we're just going to handle that for you. What you have here now, if you add weather stations back, you'd have weather stations, the live table, and then the archive table. They're separate objects or separate items. Hopefully anyone that's coming in here and using this data logically can say, this is an archived version of the data. I should use the current version that's just weather stations. So that's about it for the demo here. Hopefully that was useful. Really encourage folks that are building in Ascend to early on establish the connections between what you're building in Ascend and the respective objects that are being populated in your data warehouse. It's really important. You can save a ton on using Ascend from that data management, data cleanup. Like I said, it's not a sexy job, but let us be your garbage collectors. We'll keep it nice and clean, and you guys can just use accurate data for all of your downstream use cases.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. Any questions from the attendees? If not, we have some seed questions in the chat we can go through. But want to pass it off to the attendees first. Any questions? And thank you for attending, by the way. Feel free to raise your hand or post questions in the chat, please. No? Okay. So first question, how is this done without Ascend, John? So for context, for people who came in kind of late, when you update a data pipeline in Ascend, we will automatically update the Snowflake table or BigQuery or Databricks, or if you're using an Ascend data plane, we'll automatically update that table and clean it up for you. So you don't have orphaned data sets in your data warehouse. And that's all done automatically. So John, how would you do that without Ascend?
So I don't think I haven't seen any tool that actually does do it like Ascend does. So I don't, like, part of it is you can't really do it in Ascend without doing a very manual process. You would need to have very strict, very rigorous and exhaustive protocols for when you update logic to a pipeline. Make sure everyone on your team is like going through a long list of checklists to say, I'm doing cleanup, I'm going back, I'm deleting the objects, I'm renaming them. Or you'd have to spend a lot of time up front to basically build this process internally. And that would probably be taking like a good chunk of time to invest up front and then to maintain that framework. So the only other way to do it is manual. And I think the big take here is like, I can't imagine anyone that is like wants to sign up for that job is like, I just want to do cleanup on a data warehouse. There's just so many other things that you should be doing in terms of optimizing, tuning that data, using that data. So not a ton of great other ways to do this besides just manual intervention. Like I said, emails going out to everyone in the database, asking them to just check off, can I delete this table? You do that quarterly. I think everyone's probably seen that process. It's just very tedious.
Yeah, I spoke to a data leader a few months ago and walked them through this and asked them how they solved it. And they use the modern data stack. So cobbling together a bunch of different tools to build data pipelines on top of Snowflake. His answer, and he's one of the thought leaders in this space, was he runs a very draconian process where every time a model is updated, there is a checklist and it is reviewed and they have to delete the old data sets, which just takes time and resources from people. And so to not be able to do that is pretty powerful and still get the same result. So that's what I heard from that person.
Yeah, I was talking to Paul earlier and he said that there was like another quote from someone like, I manage my team with an iron fist or something along those lines, where it's just like, hey, like you got to follow this checklist and you got to clean up your mess that you make. And if you don't, like you're going to be in trouble. So yeah, ideally we can make that experience a little bit better.
Yeah. So another question, and please raise your hand or type in the chat if you have questions. What happens if I accidentally delete something in Ascend? So I set this up and I update and delete something I do not want to delete. What happens there?
Yeah, so that's where the strategy you can choose between those strategies, and it just depends how you're building. If you're doing a lot of building and changing things in the UI, then maybe you want to set kind of that safety net of having the archival deletion process so that you can always be like, okay, wait, here, this thing was available there. There's Also, something that we're super excited to get out here, which is called like zero cost rollback, which is you can easily go back to a previous version of your pipeline and all of the data that persisted in that pipeline with zero cost. So you can roll back really easily. You don't need to worry about it, which actually is very similar to tools and protocols that are in place in warehouses. Like Snowflake has basically a retention period of saying, hey, this data, while we deleted the table, you can recover that table in Snowflake for a period of time. And you can set that setting within your account. So what we're doing in Ascend is similar to that, because everyone does do that. Like you don't work in the data space unless you delete a table that you weren't, or drop a table that you weren't supposed to, and you got to go recover it. So we're introducing a similar mechanism to do the same.
Great.
I'm trying to remember what the tool is. I think it's called time travel in Snowflake, and I know BigQuery and Databricks have similar recovery tools because mistakes do happen.
Yeah, I do believe it's time travel in Snowflake. Great. I think you covered this one, but does this immediately delete tables in Snowflake as well? Like, is it immediate?
It is immediate. Like what you saw here in the demo is I removed a component. You remove it in the pipeline, we're going to say we're now going to remove this from Snowflake. We don't want there to be any delay in that, because what if someone's going to go the next minute and go try and pull some data? So we keep things exactly up to date as fast as possible. So the change happens immediately, which is intentional and designed that way. And we just want to make it as easy as possible to roll back that change. And then there's a whole another piece of a discussion. Maybe for a future webinar, we can talk about CI/CD integrations with Ascend, so that when you actually are making changes to the logic of a pipeline, you're doing that in a version controlled system like GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, and you're making the changes there, and you're doing a standard create a branch, create that change, test that change, push that out to Ascend. If you want to roll back to a previous version, you can do that immediately. You know who made what change when. And so that's actually how a lot of our users are interacting with Ascend, is in that way, because they want to make sure that they're really controlling change that happens to their data pipelines.
Awesome. Thank you, John. I think we're almost at time. Last call for questions from the audience, and if there are none, we can give you some time back, but I'll go into an awkward silence for about 20 seconds.
No questions. We nailed it, Jimmy. We covered it all, but
Nailed it.
I'm sure if
Clear as
anything,
mud.
give us a shout.
Yeah. Thank you so much for attending this week's webinar, or this week's demo. And we will have this recording available, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.